This is an audiobook edition of Jawaharlal Nehru's autobiography,
produced and narrated by Giripala Joshi.
Chapter 5: Back Home and Wartime Politics in India. Towards the end of 1912, India was, politically, very dull. Tilak was in jail, the extremists had been sat upon and were lying low without any effective leadership. Bengal was quiet after the unsettling of the partition of the province, and the moderates had been effectively rallied to the Minto-Morley scheme of councils. There was some interest in Indians overseas, especially in the condition of Indians in South Africa. The Congress was a moderate group, meeting annually, passing some feeble resolutions and attracting little attention. I visited, as a delegate, the Bankipur Congress during Christmas 1912. It was very much an English-knowing upper-class affair, where morning coats and well-pressed trousers were greatly in evidence. Essentially, it was a social gathering with no political excitement or tension. Gokhale, fresh from South Africa, attended it and was the outstanding person of the session. High-strung, full of earnestness and a nervous energy, he seemed to be one of the few persons present who took politics and public affairs seriously and felt deeply about them. I was impressed by him. A characteristic incident occurred when Gokhale was leaving Bankipur. He was a member of the Public Services Commission at the time, and, as such, was entitled to a first-class railway compartment to himself. He was not well, and crowds and uncongenial company upset him. He liked to be left alone by himself, and, after the strain of the Congress session, he was looking forward to a quiet journey by train. He got his compartment, but the rest of the train was crowded with delegates returning to Calcutta. After a little while, Bhupendra Nath Basu, who later became a member of the India Council, came up to Gokhale and casually asked him if he could travel in his compartment. Mr. Gokhale was a little taken aback, as Mr. Basu was an aggressive talker, but naturally he agreed. A few minutes later, Mr. Basu again came up to Gokhale and asked him if he would mind if a friend of his also travelled in the same compartment. Mr. Gokhale again mildly agreed. A little before the train left, Mr. Basu mentioned casually that both he and his friend would find it very uncomfortable to sleep in the upper berths, so would Gokhale mind occupying an upper berth so that the two lower berths might be taken by them. And that, I think, was the arrangement arrived at, and poor Mr. Gokhale had to climb up and spend a bad night. I took to the law and joined the High Court. The work interested me to a certain extent. The early months after my return from Europe were pleasant. I was glad to be back home and to pick up old threads. But gradually the life I led, in common with most others of my kind, began to lose all its freshness, and I felt that I was being engulfed in a dull routine of a pointless and futile existence. I suppose my mongrel, or at least mixed education, was responsible for this feeling of dissatisfaction with my surroundings. The habits and the ideas that had grown in me during my 7 years in England did not fit in with things as I found them. Fortunately, my home atmosphere was fairly congenial, and that was some help, but it was not enough. For the rest, there was the bar library and the club, and the same people were to be found in both, discussing the same old topics, usually connected with the legal profession, over and over again. Decidedly, the atmosphere was not intellectually stimulating, and a sense of the utter insipidity of life grew upon me. There were not even worthwhile amusements or diversions. G. Lowes Dickinson is reported by E. M. Forster in his recent life of him to have once said about India, "And why can't the races meet? Simply because the Indians bore the English. That is the simple adamantine fact." It is possible that most Englishmen feel that way, and it is not surprising. To quote Forster again from another book, every Englishman in India feels and behaves, and rightly, as if he was a member of an army of occupation, and it is quite impossible for natural and unrestrained relations between the two races to grow under these circumstances. The Englishman and the Indian are always posing to each other, and naturally they feel uncomfortable in each other's company. Each bores the other and is glad to get away from him to breathe freely and move naturally again. Usually the Englishman meets the same set of Indians, those connected with the official world, and he seldom reaches really interesting people, and if he reached them, he would not easily draw them out. The British regime in India has pushed up into prominence, even socially, the official class, both British and Indian, and this class is most singularly dull and narrow-minded. Even a bright young Englishman on coming out to India will soon relapse into a kind of intellectual and cultural torpor and will get cut off from all live ideas and movements. After a day in office, dealing with the ever-rotating and never-ending files, he will have some exercise and then go to his club to mix with his kind, drink whiskey, and read Punch and the illustrated weeklies from England. He hardly reads books, and if he does, he will probably go back to an old favourite. And for this gradual deterioration of mind he will blame India, curse the climate, and generally anathematize the tribe of agitators who add to his troubles, not realizing that the cause of intellectual and cultural decay lies in the hidebound bureaucratic and despotic system of government which flourishes in India, and of which he is a tiny part. If that is the fate of the English official, in spite of his leaves and furloughs, the Indian official working with him or under him is not likely to fare better, for he tries to model himself on the English type. Few experiences are more dreary than sitting with high-placed officials, both English and Indian, in that seat of empire, New Delhi, and listening to their unending talk about promotions, leave rules, furloughs, transfers, and little tidbits of service scandal. This official and service atmosphere invaded and set the tone for almost all Indian middle-class life, especially the English-knowing intelligentsia, except to some extent in cities like Calcutta and Bombay. Professional men, lawyers, doctors and others succumbed to it, and even the academic halls of the semi-official universities were full of it. All these people lived in a world apart, cut off from the masses and even the lower middle class. Politics was confined to this upper strata. The nationalist movement in Bengal from 1906 onwards had for the first time shaken this up and infused a new life in the Bengal lower middle class and to a small extent even the masses. This process was to grow rapidly in later years under Gandhiji's leadership, but a nationalist struggle, though life-giving, is a narrow creed and absorbs too much energy and attention to allow of other activities. Footnote: I have referred to Mr. Gandhi or Mahatma Gandhi as Gandhiji throughout these pages, as he himself prefers this to the addition of Mahatma to his name. But I have seen some extraordinary explanations of this G in books and articles by English writers. Some have imagined that it is a term of endearment, Gandhiji meaning dear little Gandhi. This is perfectly absurd and shows colossal ignorance of Indian life. G is one of the commonest additions to a name in India, being applied indiscriminatingly to all kinds of people and to men, women, boys, girls and children. It conveys an idea of respect, something equivalent to Mr., Mistress or Miss. Hindustani is rich in courtly phrases and prefixes and suffixes to names and honorific titles. G is the simplest of these and the least formal of them, though perfectly correct. I learned from my brother-in-law, Ranjit S. Pandit, that this G has a long and honorable ancestry. It is derived from the Sanskrit Arya, meaning a gentleman or noble-born, not the Nazi meaning of Aryan. This Arya became in Prakrit a Ja, and this led to the simple G. End of footnote. I felt, therefore, dissatisfied with life in those early years after my return from England. My profession did not fill me with a wholehearted enthusiasm. Politics, which to me meant aggressive nationalist activity against foreign rule, offered no scope for this. I joined the Congress and took part in its occasional meetings. When a special occasion arose, like the agitation against the Fiji indenture system for Indian workers or the South African Indian question, I threw myself into it with energy and worked hard. But these were only temporary occupations. I indulged in some diversions like shikar, but I had no special aptitude or inclination for it. I liked the outings and the jungle, and cared little for the killing. Indeed, my reputation was a singularly bloodless one, although I once succeeded, more or less by a fluke, in killing a bear in Kashmir. An incident with a little antelope damped even the little ardor that I possessed for shikar. This harmless little animal fell down at my feet, wounded to death, and looked up at me with its great big eyes full of tears. Those eyes have often haunted me since. I was attracted in those early years to Mr. Gokhale's Servants of India Society. I never thought of joining it, partly because its politics were too moderate for me, and partly because I had no intention then of giving up my profession. But I had a great admiration for the members of the society who had devoted themselves for a bare pittance to the country's service. Here at least, I thought, was straight and single-minded and continuous work, even though this might not be on wholly right lines. Mr. Srinivas Shastri, however, gave me a great shock in a little matter quite unconnected with politics. He was addressing a students' meeting in Allahabad, and he told them to be respectful and obedient to their teachers and professors, and to observe carefully all the rules and regulations laid down by constituted authority. All this goody-goody talk did not appeal to me much. It seemed very platitudinous and somewhat undesirable, with all its stress on authoritarianism. I thought that this was perhaps due to the semi-official atmosphere which was so prevalent in India. Mr. Shastri went on and called upon the boys to report each other's sins of omission and commission immediately to the authorities. In other words, they were to spy on each other and play the part of informers. These hard words were not used by Mr. Shastri, but their meaning seemed to me clear, and I listened aghast to this friendly counsel of a great leader. I had freshly returned from England, and the lesson that had been most impressed upon my mind in school and college was never to betray a colleague. There was no greater sin against the canons of good form than to sneak and inform, and thus get a companion into trouble. A sudden and complete reversal of this principle upset me, and I felt that there was a great difference between Mr. Shastri's morality and the morality that had been taught to me. The World War absorbed our attention. It was far off, and did not at first affect our lives much, and India never felt the full horror of it. Politics petered out and sank into insignificance. The Defence of India Act, the equivalent of the British DORA, held the country in its grip. From the second year onwards, news of conspiracies and shootings came to us, and of press gang methods to enroll recruits in the Punjab. There was little sympathy with the British in spite of loud professions of loyalty. Moderate and extremist alike learnt with satisfaction of German victories. There was no love for Germany, of course, only the desire to see our own rulers humbled. It was the weak and helpless man's idea of vicarious revenge. I suppose most of us viewed the struggle with mixed feelings. Of all the nations involved, my sympathies were probably most with France. The ceaseless and unabashed propaganda on behalf of the Allies had some effect, although we tried to discount it greatly. Gradually, political life grew again. Lokmanya Tilak came out of prison, and Home Rule Leagues were started by him and Mrs. Besant. I joined both, but I worked especially for Mrs. Besant's league. Mrs. Besant began to play an ever-increasing part in the Indian political scene. The annual sessions of the Congress became a little more exciting, and the Muslim League began to march with the Congress. The atmosphere became electric, and most of us young men felt exhilarated and expected big things in the near future. Mrs. Besant's internment added greatly to the excitement of the intelligentsia and vitalized the Home Rule movement all over the country. The Home Rule Leagues were attracting not only all the old extremists who had been kept out of the Congress since 1907, but large numbers of newcomers from the middle classes. They did not touch the masses. Mrs. Besant's internment stirred even the older generation, including many of the moderate leaders. Just before the internment, I remember how moved we used to be by the eloquent speeches of Mr. Srinivas Shastri, which we read in the papers. But just before or after the internment, suddenly Mr. Shastri became silent. He failed us completely when the time for action came, and there was considerable disappointment and resentment at his silence when most of all a lead was needed. I am afraid that ever since then the conviction has grown upon me that Mr. Shastri is not a man of action and a crisis does not suit his genius. Other moderate leaders, however, went ahead, some to draw back later, some to remain in the new position. I remember that there was a great deal of discussion in those days about the new Indian Defence Force, which the government was organizing from the middle classes on the lines of the European Defence Forces in India. This Indian force was treated very differently from the European force in a variety of ways, and many of us felt that we should not cooperate with it till these humiliating distinctions were removed. After much discussion, however, we decided to cooperate in the UP as it was considered worthwhile for our young men to have military training even under these conditions. I sent my application to join the new force, and we formed a committee in Allahabad to push the scheme on. Just then came Mrs. Besant's internment, and in the excitement of the moment I managed to get the committee members. They included my father, Dr. Tez Bahadur Sapru, Mr. C.Y. Chintamani, and other moderate leaders, to agree to cancel our meeting and all other work in connection with the Defence Force as a protest against the government's action. A public notice was issued immediately to this effect. I think some of the signatories regretted later this aggressive act in wartime. Mrs. Besant's internment also resulted in my father and other moderate leaders joining the Home Rule League. Some months later, most of these moderate members resigned from the League. My father remained in it and became the president of the Allahabad branch. Gradually, my father had been drifting away from the orthodox moderate position. His nature rebelled against too much submission and appealed to an authority which ignored us and treated us disdainfully. But the old extremist leaders did not attract him. Their language and methods jarred upon him. The episode of Mrs. Besant's internment and subsequent events influenced him considerably, but still he hesitated before definitely committing himself to a forward line. Often he used to say in those days that moderate tactics were no good, but nothing effective could be done till some solution for the Hindu-Muslim question was found. If this was found, then he promised to go ahead with the youngest of us. The adoption by the Congress at Lucknow in 1916 of the Joint Congress League scheme, which had been drawn up at a meeting of the All India Congress Committee in our house, pleased him greatly as it opened the way to a joint effort, and he was prepared to go ahead, then even at the cost of breaking with his old colleagues of the moderate group. They pulled together till and during Edwin Montagu's visit to India as Secretary of State. Differences arose soon after the publication of the Montagu-Chelmsford Report, and the final break in the United Provinces came in the summer of 1918 at a special provincial conference held at Lucknow over which my father presided. The moderates, expecting that this conference would adopt a strong line against the Montagu-Chelmsford proposals, boycotted the conference. Later, they also boycotted the special session of the Congress held to consider these proposals. Since then, they have been out of the Congress. This moderate practice of quietly dropping out and keeping away from the Congress sessions and other public gatherings, and not even presenting their viewpoint and fighting for it, even though the majority might be against them, struck me as peculiarly undignified and unbecoming in public workers. I think that was the general sense of large numbers of people in the country, and I am sure that the almost total collapse of the moderates in Indian politics was partly due to this timid attitude. Mr. Shastri was, I think, the only moderate leader who attended some of the early sessions of the Congress, which had been boycotted by the moderates as a group, and put forward his solitary viewpoint. He went up in public estimation because of it. My own political and public activities in the early war years were modest, and I kept away from addressing public gatherings. I was still diffident and terrified of public speaking. Partly also I felt that public speeches should not be in English, and I doubted my capacity to speak at any length in Hindustani. I remember a little incident when I was induced to deliver my first public speech in Allahabad. Probably it was in 1915, but I am not clear about dates and am rather mixed up about the order of events. The occasion was a protest meeting against a Pew Act muzzling the press. I spoke briefly and in English. As soon as the meeting was over, Dr. Tej Bahadur Sapru, to my great embarrassment, embraced and kissed me in public on the dais. This was not because of what I had said or how I had said it. His effusive joy was caused by the mere fact that I had spoken in public, and thus a new recruit had been obtained for public work, for this work consisted in those days practically of speaking only. I remember that many of us young men in Allahabad then had a faint hope that perhaps Dr. Sapru might take up a more advanced attitude in politics. Of all the moderate group in the city, he seemed to be the most likely to do so because he was emotional and could occasionally be carried by enthusiasm. Compared to him, my father seemed cold-bloodedness itself, though underneath this outer cover there was fire enough. But father's strength of will left us little hope, and for a brief while we actually had greater expectations from Dr. Sapru. Pandit Madan Mohan Malviya, with his long record of public work, attracted us of course, and we used to have long talks with him, pressing him to give a brave lead to the country. At home in those early years, political questions were not peaceful subjects for discussion, and references to them, which were frequent, immediately produced a tense atmosphere. Father had been closely watching my growing drift towards extremism, my continual criticism of the politics of talk, and my insistent demand for action. What action it should be was not clear, and sometimes father imagined that I was heading straight for the violent courses adopted by some of the young men of Bengal. This worried him very much. As a matter of fact, I was not attracted that way, but the idea that we must not tamely submit to existing conditions and that something must be done began to obsess me more and more. Successful action, from the national point of view, did not seem to be at all easy, but I felt that both individual and national honor demanded a more aggressive and fighting attitude to foreign rule. Father himself was dissatisfied with the moderate philosophy, and a mental conflict was going on inside him. He was too obstinate to change from one position to another until he was absolutely convinced that there was no other way. Each step forward meant for him a hard and bitter tussle in his mind, and when the step was taken after that struggle with part of himself, there was no going back. He had not taken it in a fit of enthusiasm, but as a result of intellectual conviction, and then, having done so, all his pride prevented him from looking back. The outward change in his politics came about the time of Mrs. Besant's internment, and from that time onward step by step he went ahead, leaving his old moderate colleagues far behind, till the tragic happenings in the Punjab in 1919 finally led him to cut adrift from his old life and his profession, and throw in his lot with the new movement started by Gandhiji. But that was still to be, and from 1915 to 1917 he was still unsure of what to do, and the doubts in him, added to his worries about me, did not make him a peaceful talker on the public issues of the day. Often enough our talks ended abruptly by his losing his temper with us. My first meeting with Gandhiji was about the time of the Lucknow Congress during Christmas 1916. All of us admired him for his heroic fight in South Africa, but he seemed very distant and different and unpolitical to many of us young men. He refused to take part in Congress or national politics then, and confined himself to the South African Indian question. Soon afterwards his adventures and victory in Champaran on behalf of the tenants of the planters filled us with enthusiasm. We saw that he was prepared to apply his methods in India also, and they promised success. I remember being moved also, in those days after the Lucknow Congress, by a number of eloquent speeches delivered by Sarojini Naidu in Allahabad. It was all nationalism and patriotism, and I was a pure nationalist, my vague socialist ideas of college days having sunk into the background. Roger Casement's wonderful speech at his trial in 1916 seemed to point out exactly how a member of a subject nation should feel. The Easter week rising in Ireland by its very failure attracted, for was that not true courage which mocked at almost certain failure and proclaimed to the world that no physical might could crush the invincible spirit of a nation? Such were my thoughts then, and yet fresh reading was again stirring the embers of socialistic ideas in my head. They were vague ideas, more humanitarian and utopian than scientific. A favorite writer of mine during the war years and after was Bertrand Russell. These thoughts and desires produced a growing conflict within me and a dissatisfaction with my profession of the law. I carried on with it because there was nothing else to be done, but I felt more and more that it was not possible to reconcile public work, especially of the aggressive type which appealed to me, with the lawyer's job. It was not a question of principle but of time and energy. Sir Raj Bihari Ghosh, the eminent Calcutta lawyer, who for some unknown reason took a fancy to me, gave me a lot of good advice as to how to get on in the profession. He especially advised me to write a book on a legal subject of my choice, as he said that this was the best way for a junior to train himself. He offered to help me with ideas in the writing of it, and to revise it. But all his well-meant interest in my legal career was in vain, and few things could be more distasteful to me than to spend my time and energy in writing legal books. Sir Raj Bihari in his old age was extraordinarily irritable and short of temper, and a terror for his juniors. I rather liked him, however, and his very failings and weaknesses were not wholly unattractive. Father and I were once his guests in Simla. It was in 1918, I think, just when the Montagu-Chelmsford report came out. He invited to dinner a few friends one evening, and among them was old Mr. Copperday. After dinner, Sir Raj Bihari and Mr. Copperday became loud and aggressive in their arguments, for they belonged to rival schools of politics, Sir Raj Bihari being a confirmed moderate, and Mr. Copperday was then supposed to be a leading Tilakite, although in later years he became as mild as a dove and too moderate even for the moderates. Mr. Copperday began criticizing Mr. Gokhale, who had died some years previously, saying that he had been a British agent who had spied on him in London. This was too much for Sir Raj Bihari, and he shouted that Gokhale had been the best of men and a particular friend of his, and that he would not permit anyone to say a word against him. Mr. Copperday then branched off to Mr. Srinivas Sastry. Sir Raj Bihari did not like this, but he did not resent it quite so much. Apparently, he was not such an admirer of Mr. Sastry's as he had been of Gokhale's. Indeed, he said that so long as Gokhale had been alive, he had helped the Servants of India Society financially, but since his death he had stopped his contribution. Mr. Copperday then, as a contrast, began praising Tilak. Here was a truly great man, he said, a wonderful person, a saint. A saint, retorted Sir Raj Bihari. I hate saints. I want to have nothing to do with them. End of chapter 5. Chapter 6. My wedding and an adventure in the Himalayas. My marriage took place in 1916 in the city of Delhi. It was on the Vasanta Panchami day, which heralds the coming of spring in India. That summer we spent some months in Kashmir. I left my family in the valley and together with a cousin of mine wandered for several weeks in the mountains and went up the Ladakh road. This was my first experience of the narrow and lonely valleys, high up in the world, which lead to the Tibetan plateau. From the top of the Zojila Pass, we saw the rich verdant mountain sides below us on one side and the bare bleak rock on the other. We went up and up the narrow valley bottom, flanked on each side by mountains, with the snow-covered tops gleaming on one side, and little glaciers creeping down to meet us. The wind was cold and bitter, but the sun was warm in the daytime, and the air was so clear that often we were misled about the distance of objects, thinking them much nearer than they actually were. The loneliness grew. There were not even trees or vegetation to keep us company, only the bare rock and the snow and ice and sometimes very welcome flowers. Yet I found a strange satisfaction in these wild and desolate haunts of nature. I was full of energy and a feeling of exaltation. I had an exciting experience during this visit. At one place on our march beyond the Zojila Pass, I think it was called Matayan, we were told that the cave of Amarnath was only 8 miles away. It was true that an enormous mountain all covered with ice and snow lay in between and had to be crossed, but what did that matter? 8 miles seemed so little. In our enthusiasm and inexperience, we decided to make the attempt. So we left our camp, which was situated at about 11,500 feet altitude, and with a small party went up the mountain. We had a local shepherd for a guide. We crossed and climbed several glaciers, roping ourselves up, and our troubles increased and breathing became a little difficult. Some of our porters, lightly laden as they were, began to bring up blood. It began to snow, and the glaciers became terribly slippery. We were fagged out, and every step meant a special effort. But still we persisted in our foolhardy attempt. We had left our camp at 4 in the morning, and after 12 hours almost continuous climbing, we were rewarded by the sight of a huge ice field. This was a magnificent sight, surrounded as it was by snow peaks like a diadem or an amphitheatre of the gods. But fresh snow and mists soon hid the sight from us. I do not know what our altitude was, but I think it must have been about 15,000 to 16,000 feet, as we were considerably higher than the cave of Amarnath. We had now to cross this ice field, a distance probably of half a mile, and then go down on the other side to the cave. We thought that as the climbing was over, our principal difficulties had also been surmounted, and so, very tired but in good humour, we began this stage of the journey. It was a tricky business, as there were many crevasses and the fresh snow often covered a dangerous spot. It was this fresh snow that almost proved to be my undoing, for I stepped upon it and it gave way, and down I went, a huge and yawning crevasse. It was a tremendous fissure, and anything that went right down, it could be assured of safekeeping and preservation for some geological ages. But the rope held, and I clutched to the side of the crevasse and was pulled out. We were shaken up by this, but still we persisted in going on. The crevasses, however, increased in number and width, and we had no equipment or means of crossing some of them. And so at last we turned back, weary and disappointed, and the cave of Amarnath remained unvisited. The higher valleys and mountains of Kashmir fascinated me so much that I resolved to come back again soon. I made many a plan and worked out many a tour, and one, the very thought of which filled me with delight, was a visit to Mansarovar, the wonder lake of Tibet, and snow-covered Kailash nearby. That was 18 years ago, and I am still as far as ever from Kailash and Mansarovar. I have not even been to visit Kashmir again, much as I have longed to, and ever more and more I have got entangled in the coils of politics and public affairs. Instead of going up mountains or crossing the seas, I have to satisfy my wanderlust by coming to prison. But still I plan, for that is a joy that no one can deny even in prison, and besides, what else can one do in prison? And I dream of the day when I shall wander about the Himalayas and cross them to reach that lake and mountain of my desire. But meanwhile, the sands of life run on, and youth passes into middle age, and that will give place to something worse, and sometimes I think that I may grow too old to reach Kailash and Mansarovar. But the journey is always worth the making, even though the end may not be in sight. Yea, in my mind these mountains rise, their perils dyed with evening's rose, and still my ghost sits at my eyes, and thirsts for their untroubled snows. Walter de la Mare. End of chapter 6.